Okay, so picking up right where we left off, in addition to being a co-secretary for the Fifth Pan-African Congress, Nkrumah was also the head of the West African National Secretariat, which was a legal organization of African nationalists, intellectuals, organizers, etc., committed to independence in West Africa. At the same time, he was also a member of an illegal organization, a conspiratorial organization called the Circle, okay, which he developed under the eye of the U.S. State Department and MI5, the British intelligence agency. Okay, and the stated aim of this organization was a union of African socialist republics. So Nkrumah co-founded this organization with Padmore and a couple of other members of his inner circle. And it had clearly subversive purposes. It had clearly a socialistic aim, and it had clearly a continental sweep in its ambitions. So this definitely indicates, in addition to the fact that one of its precepts was to defend and protect the African Revolution by force if necessary, this indicates the revolutionary cast of mind that Nkrumah had going into West African politics proper. Okay, so in 1947, there were new legal conditions in the Gold Coast colony. Now, at this time, the British Empire is still reeling from its bombardment by the Nazis, and it also was forced to concede freedom to India. Okay, so India won its independence ostensibly. The movement of Gandhi and of peaceful resistance, right, nonviolent resistance, was the fatal blow to British colonialism. But this was only on the surface, right? When you actually look beneath the surface, there were several uprisings that were communist-led in several instances in India that, the British Empire, which was financially in a state of collapse at this point, could not sustain. It could not, marshal the resources really to repress these uprisings. So rather than, giving the victory through violent struggle to anti-colonial forces, revolutionary forces in India, it went with the safer alternative in Gandhi and in Gandhiism, okay, which had its own contradictions. But this background also informs the freedom struggle in Africa. And this is why, just as an aside, it's important for African revolutionaries to be tuned in to the struggles of other colonized people. Right? It's not enough for us to just think strictly in terms of the Black struggle and the African struggle, because the African struggle is intimately tied up with the global network of colonialism and neo-colonialism. And if you're not able to register the weaknesses of empire in one front of that struggle, then you're not going to know what your prospects for freedom are in Africa, in the Caribbean, in the domestic colony, in the United States, etc. Okay, so in 1947, these new legal conditions, which probably indicated that the British could, read the signs, read the writing on the wall, at least in the colonies that were not settler colonies, where they didn't have to have, a massive transfer of the population. These new legal conditions allowed for the formation of legal constitutional parties, which would very gradually work out some kind of, milquetoast independence. And these, the earliest efforts were spearheaded by a number of petty bourgeois intellectuals, businessmen, etc., under the United Gold Coast Convention. Okay, so this party was primarily led by the middle class African intelligentsia, okay, which was co-opted into the colonial program already. They drew on Nkrumah, who had this reputation as, a fierce activist organizer against even their own inclinations, because they needed a full-time organizer, because most of them, they had law or medical practices to look after. They didn't have the time to commit full-time to the liberation of their people. So, they invited Nkrumah to the Gold Coast to become the General Secretary of the UGCC in 1947. He accepted, and he very quickly ingratiated himself with and tied himself into the African masses, specifically a segment of the population, the urban population known as the Veranda Boys, who were, what Karl Marx would call lumpen proletariat, right? They didn't have any regular means of occupation. They were just sort of like layabouts who had, maybe a modicum of education, maybe a little bit of training, but there were no real prospects for them. So they were hungry for change. But of course, petty bourgeois leadership of the UGCC would certainly have not seen them as an important constituency. And they actually saw not just the Veranda Boys in particular, but the African masses generally as untutored, unprepared for independence, and a potentially dangerous element. Okay, so Nkrumah tended to disagree with the leadership of the UGCC, like J.B. Dankwa, about the prospects for militant mass action in rapidly winning full independence for the Gold Coast. Okay, and this contradiction would develop between 1947 and 1950. Okay, so as C.L.R. James describes in the History of Pan-African Revolt, in 1948, there were two really important events with the masses that really affected the prospects for liberation in a positive way. Okay, the first was a mass boycott beginning in January of 1948 against European goods, okay, because the prices for these imported goods, as Nkrumah described already in Towards Colonial Freedom, the prices were exorbitant. They were hyper-exploitative, okay? And this boycott went on for a while, and then it temporarily abated. At the same time, there was an ex-serviceman march to the Christiansborg Castle, where the governor held his residence. Okay, the ex-servicemen who were returning soldiers from World War II had a number of complaints that they drafted into a petition. They didn't march on the castle with any arms or anything like this, but they were shot on, right, by the governor's guard. And this, in combination with the inflated prices of European goods, led to a number of violent revolts in early 1948. Okay, so the masses were moving in a violent, rebellious direction, if not necessarily a revolutionary direction. Now, colonialists don't understand what really makes history, okay? They think that individuals who have great exceptional talents or education or whatever are the real shapers of history. But the real shapers of history are the masses who produce, what is necessary for all of us to live, okay? And so they mistook this popular fervor and dissatisfaction with the colonial status quo for the work of the UGCC. So there was a group, a clique in the eyes of the colonial administration called the Big Six that they arrested, including Nkrumah and Dankwa. Okay, so this is just a measure of the dialectic of imperialism, colonialism on the one hand, and the masses and their contradictory leadership on the other. Okay, the UGCC, the Big Six were eventually released, but the UGCC was increasingly suspicious of Nkrumah, okay, who had all of this pull with the African masses. So they actually suspended him as Gensec. But he did have a really important faction within the United Gold Coast Convention. So during his suspension, they actually formed their own political party called the Convention People's Party in April 1949. And I'll say a little bit more in the next video about the relationship of the CPP with the UGCC and all of that good stuff leading up to the actual struggle for independence.